Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I'm glad to be here and hear the comments of my friend from South Carolina, Senator Scott. Made me glad that I get to sit by him on the Senate floor and to hear the reasons, and they are good and they have been repeated many times about why this is not a way forward for the United States. It's not a way forward for the Middle East. In fact, Senator Scott did a great job talking about what was in the deal, but what wasn't in the deal. What wasn't in the deal was nothing the president said would be there when the negotiations started. When the negotiations started, the administration said that Iran would never be allowed to have nuclear weapons, that we'd find out everything Iran had ever done to try to develop nuclear weapons, that we'd have anywhere, anytime inspections, and that sanctions would only be lifted when real progress was made in those first three areas. That was the framework. That was what we were negotiating for. And, Mr. President, none of those things happened. None of those things are in this agreement. I think the question that you and I and others in the Senate are hearing from when we're home, when we're talking to people about this agreement, is one question is the Congress giving away its power? How is it possible that something like this could happen and the Congress, a majority of the Congress, couldn't do anything to stop it? And of course, the other question is, or is the president giving away the power of the United States of America to lead? I think it is as clear from this agreement as it is so many other things that leading from behind doesn't work. A view that the United States of America is just any other country in the world is not a view that leads to a peaceful, more stable world. In fact, our friends don't trust us, and our enemies aren't afraid of us. In a world where there is vast agreement, there are more potential bad things that could happen from more potential places than any time ever before. That's not just Republicans. That's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the head of the National Director of Intelligence. That's the head of the CIA. They all come up with that same conclusion. And we look at the president's foreign policy that this is just one symptom of. Remember the red line in Syria, that if the Syrians do this, we're going to do that? Well, the Syrians did what we said we wouldn't allow them to do, and basically we didn't do much of anything. In fact, what happened was that when the United States of America takes that kind of position and doesn't move forward, Assad is emboldened. I think the latest number of Syrians that have been killed by Assad is now around 250,000 people, from chemical weapons to barrel bombs to every way they can think of to massacre their own population, a population that has been displaced in the millions and both inside and now outside the country. So an emboldened Assad, Russia, Putin looks at this, and before you know it, Putin has taken control of Crimea, and Putin has Russian troops in Ukraine. And this week, Putin puts Russian troops and tanks in Syria. Every American president since President Truman, whose desk I'm standing, one of the desks President Truman used as a senator on the floor is this desk right here with his name carved in it. President Truman in 1946 did whatever was necessary to force the Soviets out of Iran. Every other president until right now has done whatever was necessary to keep the Russian influence in the Middle East at a minimum, and they're building a base right now. They're unloading equipment right now. Their things are happening because they think, why? Because they think they can get away with it. The Chinese, that's the Russian reset, the Asian pivot. The Chinese are building an island on an atoll in the South China Sea that's within striking range of the Philippines. Why? Because they think, Mr. President, they can get away with it. And the more we're faced with this agreement, the more we look at the consequences of the agreement, the more we wonder about it. But why aren't we able to stop it? One, Mr. President, no future administration is bound by it. For weeks now, on this floor and around the country, people have talked about the destabilizing impact this agreement will have on the Middle East and the world. And the only administration that's bound by it is this one. It's not a treaty. If it was a treaty, as it should be, we'd be voting in the Senate on a treaty, and 2/3 of the senators would have to approve the treaty, and the next administration would be bound by it as well. When presidential candidates, Mr. President, say, I'll reverse this the first day, they absolutely can reverse it the first day. What kind of policy is that to put in place that has this kind of destabilizing effect without even a sense that the United States for the long term is committed to it? Now, I'm sure the president believes by the time he leaves that every other president surely would want to keep this agreement, but I don't know how you could listen to this debate and think that. It does dramatically change the Middle East. Neighboring countries don't trust Iran. They'll want to have whatever weapons Iran has, and Senator Scott just made the point and made it well that you can circle the date on the calendar of when Iran is likely to have a nuclear weapon if this agreement goes forward. And more importantly, the hope that, well, maybe the government would change. It might, but that won't keep the neighbors from deciding they've got to defend themselves. You know, as if North Korea wasn't bad enough. The 1994 agreement with North Korea wasn't bad enough. See, they had a missile announcement just today, I believe, of they have a better delivery system for the weapon they were never going to have. If North Korea wasn't bad enough, we have truly let the nuclear genie out of the bottle here, because the neighbors will believe that they're going to have a weapon when Iran has one. They'll also all believe that Iran will cheat. And so even though Iran's theoretically on a 12-month clock, it might not be 12 months from the day they say we're now going into full weapons mode, and 12 months from now we'll have one. And so even if Iran would change its mind, you're going to have 3 or 4 countries in a very short period of time, in my view, that will have nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons capability that don't have it right now. At the Munich Security Conference in 2014, a conference that a handful of senators normally go to, and I went to that conference that year, and we were meeting with the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and he said, we'll be able to know everything the Iranians are doing. We'll be able to monitor this with such detail that there's no way they will be able to do anything that we don't know about. And I said to Secretary Kerry at the time, I said, you will not be, even if that was true, and I said, I don't believe it will be true, but even if that was true, you won't be able to contain enrichment. Once you let Iran do this, other countries that are perfectly happy where they are right now will feel like that they have to do the same thing. There are well over a dozen countries that have nuclear power that don't do what we're about to allow Iran to get in a place to do. We have been able to control this because the world has understood that it needed to be controlled, but we are now in the beginnings of letting this get out of control. So what's the vote all about? It's not a treaty. Why are we voting at all? If it doesn't bind the next administration, why are we having this debate? The Congress would have liked to be involved, or the administration would have liked to have the Congress involved in about 2023. That was another great comment often made before the law was passed that allowed us to do what we were doing today was, well, Congress will eventually have to be involved because eventually they'll decide whether to extend the sanctions regime or not. The one, by the way, that went into effect in 2013 is on the books until 2023. So the ideal day for this administration, for the Congress to be involved, was about 7 years after they left office. That would have been the involvement we would have had if the Congress had not stepped up and said, we're going to insist we get involved. The Congress in 2006 took back some of the authority. This is not the first Congress to lose authority to the president. We took back some of the authority that the president had, and we put into law the sanctions that had been imposed by the president at that time. And we made them not just President Bush's idea, but a law. I was there when that was negotiated, and one of the things we did when we negotiated that was to insist that that be codified, that become the pattern, and it did, for all the sanctions to follow. But the pattern that the Congress followed was also a pattern that in almost every case since World War II the Congress followed, which is, here's what we're going to do, here's what we believe the president and the country should do, but we're going to give the president national security waiver authority. And that's the authority the president has decided to use, without congressional approval, without changing the law, but following the law. He's decided he's going to waive these sanctions, and the Congress could weigh in again in about 2023 if the president would have had his way totally. And so what are we doing here? The President of the United States is about to prop up the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. This is an unarguable point. Nobody argues that Iran is not the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They clearly look stronger at the end of this deal than they did at the beginning, because they are stronger. The President of the United States is about to release billions of dollars that the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world can use for terrorist causes. With the support of a minority of the Congress, and not only a minority of the Congress, but that minority happens to be all of one side. There is nothing like this, Mr. President, in the post-war history of the country, where the country stepped forward in this way, in this big a thing, and not only is a majority against it, but the bipartisan majority is opposed to it. The partisan minority is blocking the Congress from even having a vote, while the bipartisan majority wants to vote, and they want to vote to disapprove this deal. Even the president then could still veto the disapproval, but the president doesn't want to do that. The president doesn't want this on his desk. I think I read the stories the other day when we, for the first time, couldn't get the 60 senators necessary to have the vote. The White House announcement was something like this: the congressional vote today ensured that the president's Iranian deal would go forward. My concern about this process the whole time is somehow it would look like that by not stopping it, the Congress was for it. We may not be able to stop it, Mr. President, but I can guarantee you the Congress is not for it, and if anybody that's been paying attention knows that. So, a question I think we could ask ourselves: would the Congress and the country be better off without this poor substitute for overseeing a meaningful foreign policy? This is clearly not producing the kind of result that a democracy should produce in foreign policy. And I think you could argue that it is a weak response, but why did it have to happen? I co-sponsored the initial bill that required the Congress to approve the deal. But of course, a piece of legislation has to be signed by the president, and Senator Corker and Senator Cardin finally came up with a piece of legislation the president would sign, but it was almost always guaranteed to ensure that the debate would go forward. So would we have been better off without it? As I've had people ask me, what are you guys doing? Why can't you get the foreign policy of the country under some control? I've wondered several times, would we have been better off to go forward without it? But as I've thought about that, Mr. President, it does seem to me that the Corker-Cardin bill has produced a number of things. One, 60 days of debate that we wouldn't have had otherwise. The Congress would have got to weigh in when? 8 years from now. We'd have had to debate 8 years from now. But we've had 60 days of debate. Well over 50% of the people of the country are opposed to going forward with this deal. Only about 21% are for going forward. This process has produced bipartisan opposition to a bad deal. And Senator Cardin, the top Democrat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Senator Menendez, the other most knowledgeable Democrat on foreign affairs, Senator Schumer, Senator Manchin, voting with the 54 Republicans. 58 senators don't want this to happen. 60% of the House of Representatives are opposing this agreement. The White House would have liked to have Congress to have its say almost a decade from now. Mr. President, we have had our say. We should have our vote. We have had our say. We should have our vote. We should be allowed to put this bill on the president's desk, and if he wants to defend it, to veto it and defend that veto, that is how this process should work. I hope there's still a chance that two more of our colleagues will step forward and say, while I'm going to be on the other side of the final vote, I think the Congress should vote. 98 members voted for this bill that said the Congress should vote to either approve or disapprove this agreement. Let's have that vote, Mr. President, and let's have that vote today. I yield.